The morning sun cast long shadows across the private airport runway as Captain Robert Williams stepped out of his rental car. He adjusted his crisp white uniform and straightened his captain's hat, taking a moment to appreciate the gleaming aircraft lined up on the tarmac. This was exactly the kind of job he lived for, flying expensive private jets for wealthy clients who appreciated true professionalism. Robert had been flying for 20 years, and he took pride in his reputation. He was known throughout the industry as a no-nonsense pilot who delivered results. Today's charter flight would be another easy paycheck, and he was already planning how he would spend his fee. As he walked toward the main hangar, Robert noticed the airport seemed busier than usual. Ground crew members moved efficiently between aircraft, and several well-dressed passengers waited in the comfortable lounge area. This place clearly catered to serious money, and Robert felt right at home. "Captain Williams?" A voice called out behind him. Robert turned to see a man approaching, carrying a flight bag and wearing a pilot's uniform. The man looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and tired eyes. His uniform was clean but slightly wrinkled, as if he had been up early or perhaps had not slept well. "I'm David Chen," the man said, extending his hand. "I'll be your co-pilot for today's flight." Robert looked David up and down, immediately forming his judgment. The man seemed tired, and there was something about his demeanor that suggested he was not entirely focused on the job. Robert had seen plenty of weekend pilots and part-time flyers who thought they could handle serious aviation work. This David fellow was probably one of them. "Right," Robert said curtly, giving David's hand a brief shake. "Well, I hope you're ready for a professional operation here. This isn't some flying club hobby flight." David's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "Of course. I've reviewed the flight plan, and I wanted to discuss a few items with you before we begin our pre-flight checks." "I'll handle the flight plan," Robert interrupted. "I've been flying these routes longer than you've probably been licensed. Just follow my lead and try to keep up." David paused for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. Should we head to the aircraft?" As they walked across the tarmac, Robert continued his assessment of his co-pilot. David seemed competent enough in his movements, but there was definitely something distracted about him. Robert had no patience for pilots who brought personal problems to work. Flying required complete focus and dedication. "So," Robert said, not really interested in the answer, "how long have you been flying?" "About 15 years, David replied. "I started in the military, then transitioned to civilian aviation." "Military, huh?" Robert's tone suggested this information did not impress him. "Well, this is different from flying cargo planes or whatever you did over there. These clients expect the highest level of service." David stopped walking and turned to face Robert. "Actually, I flew fighter jets and transport aircraft. But you're right that civilian flying is different. The safety standards and attention to detail required are just as important, though." Robert waved dismissively. Sure. Military guys always think their experience automatically translates. But this is about customer service and professionalism. These passengers are paying top dollar." They continued walking toward a sleek white aircraft that gleamed in the morning sunlight. It was clearly an expensive model, probably worth several $1,000,000. Robert felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the kind of aircraft he deserved to be flying. "Beautiful plane," Robert commented, running his hand along the fuselage. "The owner must have excellent taste. And deep pockets." David said nothing, but Robert noticed him checking his watch. It was barely 8 in the morning, but the co-pilot already seemed anxious about time. "Problem?" Robert asked. "No problem," David said. "I just need to make sure we stay on schedule today. I have to pick up my daughter from school this afternoon." Robert's expression hardened. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. "Your daughter?" "Listen, Chen, I don't know what kind of operations you're used to, but when we're on a job, the job comes first. Period. You can't be thinking about school pickups and family obligations. I understand the importance of the job, David said quietly. I wouldn't compromise safety or service. I just mentioned it because punctuality is important to me. Punctuality is important to everyone in this business, Robert snapped. But dedication means being willing to stay late if the client needs it. Being willing to put the mission first. I'm starting to wonder if you're really cut out for this level of flying. David's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. I assure you, Captain Williams, that my commitment to safety and service is absolute. Shall we begin the pre-flight inspection? Robert gestured toward the aircraft. You handle the exterior inspection. I'll check the cockpit systems. Try not to miss anything important. As David began his careful examination of the aircraft exterior, Robert climbed aboard to inspect the interior. The cabin was luxuriously appointed with leather seats, polished wood panels, and state-of-the-art entertainment systems. This was definitely a high-end operation. In the cockpit, Robert familiarized himself with the controls and instruments. Everything was top quality and perfectly maintained. Whoever owned this aircraft clearly spared no expense. Robert made mental notes about the various systems, planning to demonstrate his expertise to both the co-pilot and the passengers. Through the cockpit window, he watched David conducting his inspection. The man was thorough, Robert had to admit, checking each component methodically. But there was still something about his demeanor that bothered Robert. Maybe it was the way David seemed to know his way around the aircraft, or how comfortable he appeared to be in this environment. Robert's phone buzzed with a text message from the charter company, passengers arriving in 30 minutes. VIP treatment requested. This confirmed Robert's assumption that today's clients were important people who expected the best. When David climbed aboard to begin the cockpit checks, Robert was ready to establish his authority clearly. All right, Chen, here's how this is going to work, Robert began. I run a tight operation. I do the passenger briefing, I handle all communication with air traffic control, and I make all the important decisions. You can monitor the instruments and follow my instructions. Think you can handle that? David settled into the right seat and began checking his instruments. I'm comfortable with standard crew resource management procedures. The captain has final authority, but both pilots contribute to safe operations. Right, Robert said impatiently. Safety first, of course. But let's be clear about who's in charge here. I didn't spend 20 years building my reputation to have it undermined by a co-pilot who's more worried about school schedules than flying. I'm not worried about anything except doing my job properly, David said, his voice remaining calm despite Robert's continued hostility. Robert continued his tirade while reviewing the flight plan. You know what I think? I think you're one of these part-time pilots. Maybe you have some other job during the week, and you fly on weekends for extra money. That's fine for flying tourists around, but this is serious business. David finished his instrument checks and turned to face Robert. Captain Williams, I understand you have concerns about working with someone new. But I assure you that my experience and qualifications are adequate for this flight. Perhaps we could focus on the pre-flight procedures. Adequate? Robert laughed harshly. Adequate doesn't cut it at this level. These clients expect excellence. They expect pilots who live and breathe aviation, not people who fit flying in around their family schedules. Before David could respond, Robert's attention was caught by movement outside the aircraft. Several airport ground crew members were approaching, and they all seemed to be looking at the cockpit. One of them, a mechanic in coveralls, waved at the aircraft. Popular guy, Robert commented sarcastically, assuming the wave was meant for him. David glanced outside and raised his hand in a brief acknowledgement. Good crew here, he said simply. You know them? Robert asked. I've worked out of this airport before, David replied, which Robert interpreted as confirmation of his weekend pilot theory. As they continued the pre-flight checklist, Robert made increasingly critical comments about David's performance, even though the co-pilot was executing every procedure correctly. Robert was determined to establish himself as the superior pilot and make sure David understood his place. "Your radio technique needs work," Robert criticized after David completed a communication check. "And you're taking too long with those calculations. In this business, efficiency matters." David absorbed each criticism without argument, but Robert could see the man's patience was being tested. Good, Robert thought. Better to establish the hierarchy now than have problems in the air. The sound of approaching vehicles indicated that the passengers would be arriving soon. Robert felt a surge of anticipation. This was his moment to shine, to demonstrate the kind of professional service that had made his reputation. He just hoped his distracted co-pilot wouldn't embarrass them both. "All right, Chen," Robert said, adjusting his uniform one final time. "Showtime. Try to look professional when the client's bored. First impressions matter in this business." David simply nodded, checking his watch once more. Robert noticed the gesture and felt his irritation spike again. This co-pilot was clearly not dedicated to excellence the way a true professional should be. Robert would have to work extra hard to make sure the flight met the high standards these wealthy passengers undoubtedly expected. As the first luxury vehicle pulled up to the aircraft, Robert prepared to demonstrate why he was considered one of the best pilots in the business. He was confident that by the end of the day, everyone involved would understand exactly who was in charge of this operation. The first black luxury sedan pulled up beside the aircraft, followed by two more vehicles. Robert straightened his uniform and prepared to greet what he assumed would be wealthy business executives or celebrities. This was his chance to demonstrate the kind of professional service that had built his reputation over 2 decades of flying. As the car doors opened, 3 well-dressed individuals stepped out. There was an older woman in an elegant business suit, a middle-aged man carrying a briefcase, and a younger woman with perfectly styled hair. They moved with the confidence that came with success and money. Robert descended from the aircraft with his most professional smile, ready to take charge of the situation. Behind him, David also emerged from the cockpit, carrying his flight bag. "Good morning," Robert announced in his most authoritative voice. "I'm Captain Williams, and I'll be your pilot today. Welcome aboard." The older woman looked past Robert directly at David. "David, good to see you again. How are you holding up?" Robert's smile faltered slightly. The woman was addressing his co-pilot, not him. This was unusual, but perhaps David had flown as a co-pilot for these passengers before on other aircraft. "I'm doing well, Margaret." "Thank you for asking," David replied warmly. "How was your conference in Denver?" "Very productive," Margaret responded. "We're looking forward to getting back home though." Robert cleared his throat loudly. "If I may, we should begin boarding soon to maintain our schedule. I've prepared a comprehensive safety briefing, and I want to review our flight plan with you." The middle-aged man with the briefcase looked at Robert with a puzzled expression. "Are you the pilot we requested?" "Yes, sir. Captain Robert Williams, 20 years of experience, impeccable safety record. You're in excellent hands today." Robert puffed out his chest with pride. David stepped forward quietly. "Robert is here to assist with today's flight. He comes highly recommended." The passengers exchanged glances but said nothing more. Robert felt slightly confused by the interaction but attributed it to David's familiarity with these particular clients. Some co-pilots were good at building relationships, even if they lacked the technical expertise that really mattered. As they prepared to board, Robert took control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll follow me aboard, I'll show you to your seats and explain our safety procedures. We'll be cruising at 38,000 feet today, and I've planned a route that will minimize any turbulence." The passengers followed Robert onto the aircraft, with David bringing up the rear. Robert launched into his standard passenger briefing, explaining emergency procedures and pointing out safety features. He spoke with authority and confidence, making sure everyone understood they were flying with a true professional. During the briefing, Robert noticed that the passengers seemed to listen politely but without the usual deference he expected from wealthy clients. In fact, they seemed more relaxed and familiar with the aircraft than most first-time passengers. Perhaps they were frequent flyers who knew what to expect. Any questions about safety procedures? Robert concluded. We're all set, thank you, Margaret replied. We appreciate your attention to detail. Robert beamed with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of response he lived for. Professional recognition from discerning clients who could appreciate quality service. As the passengers settled into their seats, Robert returned to the cockpit where David was already running through the final checklist items. Robert was annoyed to see that his co-pilot had presumed to begin procedures without explicit permission. Chen, I told you I'd handle the important items, Robert said sharply. Don't get ahead of yourself. I was just completing the standard checklist, David replied calmly. Everything is ready for departure. I'll determine when everything is ready, Robert snapped. This isn't some casual flying club operation where everyone does whatever they feel like. There's a chain of command here. David's phone suddenly rang, interrupting Robert's lecture. David glanced at the screen and his expression became serious. I need to take this quickly, David said. It's my daughter's school. Robert's face reddened with anger. Are you kidding me? We're about to taxi, and you're taking personal calls. This is exactly what I was talking about. David had already answered the phone. Hello, this is David Chen. Yes, Emma is my daughter. Robert could hear a woman's voice on the other end, though he couldn't make out the specific words. David's expression grew more concerned as he listened. I understand, David said into the phone. Yes, I can be there by 3 o'clock. Thank you for calling. David ended the call and immediately began calculating flight times on his tablet. Robert watched with growing disgust. Let me guess, Robert said sarcastically. Family emergency. Couldn't possibly wait until after we've completed our professional responsibilities. It's a parent-teacher conference, David explained without looking up from his calculations. They've moved it up due to a scheduling conflict. I need to be there by 3 o'clock. Robert laughed harshly. A parent-teacher conference? You're worried about a parent-teacher conference while we're preparing for takeoff? This is unbelievable. I can make it if we maintain our scheduled arrival time, David said, still focused on his tablet. The flight duration plus travel time should work. Should work? Robert's voice rose. Should work? Listen here, Chen, let me explain something to you about professional flying. When you're on a job, that job comes first. Period. Not school conferences, not family obligations, not anything else. David finally looked up from his tablet, and Robert could see frustration building in his eyes. I understand the importance of the job. I would never compromise safety or service. I'm simply trying to manage my schedule efficiently. Efficiently? Robert continued his attack. You know what's efficient? Not having divided attention. Not thinking about picking up kids from school while you're supposed to be focused on flying. This is exactly why single parents make unreliable pilots. The words hung in the air like a challenge. David's expression hardened, and for a moment Robert thought his co-pilot might finally snap back at him. Instead, David took a deep breath and returned to his preparations. We should complete our taxi checklist, David said quietly. Robert decided to press his advantage. Look, I get it. Being a single dad is tough. But maybe you should consider whether this level of flying is really suitable for someone with your kind of obligations. Maybe stick to weekend tourist flights where the schedule is more flexible. David's hands tightened on his flight controls, but he said nothing. Robert felt satisfied that he was finally getting through to this distracted co-pilot. As they began taxiing toward the runway, Robert continued his commentary. You know what separates real professional pilots from part-timers? Dedication. Commitment. The willingness to put the mission first, even when it's inconvenient. Through the cockpit windows, Robert noticed ground crew members waving as they passed. Several of them seemed to be waving specifically at David's side of the aircraft. Again, Robert found this odd but assumed David must have worked at this airport as a co-pilot many times. Popular with the ground crew, Robert commented. I guess they appreciate a co-pilot who doesn't give them too much trouble. David keyed his radio to contact ground control. Ground control, this is November 7-4 Alpha requesting taxi clearance to runway 27. November 7-4 Alpha, you're cleared to taxi to runway 27 via taxiway Alpha. Contact tower on 120.9er. Robert was irritated that David had initiated the radio call without permission, but he decided to let it slide this time. At least his co-pilot's radio technique was adequate, even if his priorities were completely wrong. As they approached the runway, Robert's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it quickly and saw it was from the charter company. Hope everything going well with Mr. Chen's aircraft. He specifically requested you for this flight. Robert frowned at the message. Mr. Chen's aircraft? That didn't make sense. The charter company must have made a mistake in their wording. David Chen was clearly just another co-pilot, probably working multiple jobs to make ends meet as a single father. Tower, November 7-4 Alpha ready for departure, David called on the radio. November 7-4 Alpha, you're cleared for takeoff runway 27. Contact departure on 124.7 after airborne. Robert decided it was time to reassert his authority. I'll take the controls for takeoff, he announced. Of course, David replied, though Robert detected a slight edge in his voice. As they lined up on the runway, Robert felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with commanding a powerful aircraft. This was what he lived for, the moment when years of experience and training came together in perfect execution. Takeoff checklist complete, David reported. Roger, Robert replied, advancing the throttles. Here we go. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and Robert felt the satisfaction of a perfect takeoff. This was professional flying at its finest, and he was confident that everyone aboard understood they were witnessing real expertise. As they climbed toward their cruising altitude, Robert continued his criticism of David's earlier behavior. You know, Chen, I've been thinking about what happened back there with your phone call. In 20 years of flying, I've never taken a personal call during flight preparations. That's the kind of discipline that separates the professionals from the amateurs. David monitored his instruments carefully but said nothing in response. I mean, what if we'd had an emergency during taxi? What if air traffic control had given us a complex routing change? Your attention was divided, thinking about school conferences instead of flying. That's dangerous. Still no response from David. Robert pressed on. And another thing, this whole single-parent situation. I'm not trying to be cruel here, but facts are facts. Aviation is demanding. It requires total commitment. Maybe you should consider a career change, something with more regular hours that would be better for raising a kid. Finally, David spoke. Captain Williams, I appreciate your concerns about professionalism. Perhaps we could focus on completing this flight safely and efficiently. I am focused on the flight, Robert shot back. I'm also focused on making sure you understand what real professional standards look like. These passengers deserve better than a co-pilot who's mentally planning school pickups. The tension in the cockpit was becoming palpable. Robert knew he was being harsh, but someone had to teach this young father about priorities. Better to learn these lessons now than to wash out of professional aviation entirely. As they leveled off at cruising altitude, Robert felt confident that he had established the proper dynamic. David Chen would understand that flying with Captain Robert Williams meant operating at the highest possible standards, with no room for personal distractions or amateur attitudes. The flight continued smoothly at cruising altitude, with Robert maintaining his critical commentary about David's professionalism. The passengers had settled into their seats, working quietly on laptops and reading documents. Robert felt satisfied with how he had handled the situation, convinced that he had properly educated his inexperienced co-pilot about real professional standards. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Robert decided to review the flight paperwork one more time. He always prided himself on attention to detail, and double-checking documents was part of his thorough approach to aviation. Opening the flight folder, Robert began examining the various forms and certificates required for the trip. Everything seemed to be in order until he reached the aircraft registration documents. Something didn't look right about the owner information section. "Chen," Robert called out, holding up a document. "There's something wrong with this paperwork. The owner registration section has some kind of error." David glanced over from his position at the controls. "What kind of error?" "It says the aircraft owner is listed as D. Chen. That's obviously a mistake. The charter company must have mixed up some paperwork. Do you know who the actual owner is supposed to be?" David was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the controls. "The paperwork is correct." Robert looked at the document again, then back at David. "Correct? How can it be correct? It says D. Chen owns this aircraft. You're D. Chen, but you're just the co-pilot." "Actually," David said calmly, "I'm not just the co-pilot." Something in David's tone made Robert pay closer attention. There was a confidence there that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet authority that seemed completely different from the submissive co-pilot he had been criticizing all morning. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, though a strange feeling was beginning to form in his stomach. David reached into his flight bag and pulled out a leather briefcase that Robert hadn't noticed before. From it, he extracted a folder of documents and handed them to Robert. "I mean, this is my aircraft, Captain Williams. I own it." Robert's face went completely pale as he looked at the documents. Aircraft ownership papers, clearly showing David Chen as the registered owner. Business licenses for Chen Aviation Services. Insurance documents listing David Chen as the primary policy holder. Everything was legitimate, official, and absolutely clear. "This is impossible," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible above the aircraft engines. "I'm afraid it's completely possible," David replied, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "In fact, I own this entire aircraft and 4 others like it. I also own the hangar where we departed from and employ most of the ground crew you saw this morning." Robert felt like the world was spinning around him. All of his assumptions, all of his criticisms, all of his condescending comments suddenly crashed down on him like an avalanche. The co-pilot he had been treating like an amateur was actually the owner of the entire operation. "But you're so young," Robert stammered. "How could you possibly?" "I'm 34 years old," David interrupted. "I spent 12 years in the military, flying combat missions and transport aircraft. After I left the service, I used my savings and a business loan to start Chen Aviation Services. That was 5 years ago." Robert's mind was reeling. "But your daughter, the school conference, you seemed so. So what?" David's voice had an edge to it now. "So unprofessional because I care about my child. So unreliable because I have family responsibilities." The full weight of Robert's behavior began to sink in. Every criticism, every condescending comment, every assumption about David being a part-time weekend pilot had been completely wrong. Worse than wrong, it had been cruel and insulting to a successful business owner who had shown nothing but patience and professionalism. "David," came a voice from the passenger cabin. Margaret, the older woman, had unbuckled her seatbelt and was standing in the cockpit doorway. "Is everything all right up here?" David turned to face her. "Everything is fine, Margaret. Captain Williams was just reviewing some paperwork." Margaret looked at Robert with an expression that suggested she might have overheard some of their conversation. "Robert, I should probably introduce myself properly. I'm Margaret Foster, Chief Financial Officer of Chen Aviation Services. The other passengers are my business partners, James Wong and Lisa Martinez. We're returning from a conference where we were discussing expansion of our fleet." Robert felt his stomach drop even further. The passengers weren't clients at all. They were David's business associates, his employees. They had witnessed him treating their boss with disrespect and arrogance. "We specifically requested you for this flight," Margaret continued, "because David had heard good things about your reputation. He was considering offering you a permanent position with our company." The word was hung in the air like a judgment. Robert understood immediately that any chance of employment with Chin Aviation Services had just evaporated. "I should get back to my seat," Margaret said diplomatically. "David, take your time with whatever you need to discuss." After Margaret returned to the cabin, David and Robert sat in silence for several minutes. The only sound was the steady hum of the aircraft engines as they continued their journey. Finally, David spoke. "Captain Williams, I want you to know that I understand your surprise. Many people make assumptions about me based on my age or my status as a single father. I'm used to it by now." Robert tried to find words to apologize, but everything he thought of seemed inadequate. David continued. 3 years ago, my wife Maria was killed in a car accident. She was on her way to pick up our daughter Emma from daycare when a drunk driver ran a red light. Emma was only 5 years old at the time." Robert felt a deep shame washing over him. All of his comments about single fathers being unreliable, about family obligations interfering with work, suddenly seemed not just wrong but cruel beyond measure. "After Maria died, I had 2 choices," David went on. "I could give up my dreams of building an aviation business, or I could find a way to balance being a good father with being a successful businessman. I chose to do both." Robert started to speak, but David held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I built this company from nothing while raising my daughter. Every decision I make, every flight I take, every employee I hire is done with the understanding that Emma is my first priority. That doesn't make me unprofessional. It makes me careful, dedicated, and motivated to succeed." Robert realized that everything he had seen as weakness or distraction in David was actually strength. The careful attention to timing, the concern about the school conference, the quiet confidence, all of it reflected a man who had learned to balance enormous responsibilities with grace and determination. "The ground crew you saw this morning work for me," David continued. "The passengers in our cabin are my business partners. The aircraft we're flying is one of 5 that I own. I employ 15 people, and we're profitable enough that I was looking to hire additional experienced pilots." Robert understood the past tense. "Was looking to hire." "Yes. Was." David's voice was firm but not angry. "Captain Williams, your technical flying skills are excellent. Your experience is impressive. But your attitude toward people you perceive as beneath you is unacceptable. I could never have someone with your prejudices representing my company." The remainder of the flight passed in uncomfortable silence. Robert focused on flying the aircraft while David monitored instruments and handled radio communications. The professional interaction continued, but the dynamic had completely changed. David was clearly the authority figure now, and Robert was simply following his lead. As they began their descent toward the destination airport, David made an announcement to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We should be on the ground in about 15 minutes." Robert managed the landing procedures competently, but he felt no satisfaction in the smooth touchdown. His mind was entirely focused on the magnitude of his mistake and the prejudices that had led to his downfall. After they parked at the gate and shut down the engines, the passengers prepared to disembark. Each of them thanked David personally and professionally, clearly comfortable with their working relationship. Margaret paused at the cockpit door. "David, don't forget Emma's conference is at 3. You should have plenty of time if you leave soon." "Thank you, Margaret. I'll head over there as soon as we're finished here." After the passengers left, David began gathering his flight materials while Robert sat in stunned silence. "Captain Williams," David said finally, "I want you to know that despite everything that happened today, I respect your flying skills. You're clearly an experienced pilot. But I hope you'll take some time to think about how you treat people, especially people you assume are in positions beneath you." Robert finally found his voice. "David, I owe you an enormous apology. My behavior today was inexcusable. I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I was cruel about your personal situation. I don't know how to make it right." David paused in his packing. "You can't make it right, Captain Williams. But you can learn from it. You can think about how your prejudices affect the way you treat people. You can consider whether the assumptions you make about others might be wrong." Robert nodded, feeling the full weight of his shame. "Is there any chance, any possibility that—" "No," David said firmly but not unkindly. "There isn't. I need people in my organization who understand that strength comes in many forms, and that being a parent doesn't make someone less professional. Your comments today showed me that you don't understand that." David finished packing his materials and stood to leave. At the cockpit door, he turned back one more time. "Captain Williams, I hope you find success with pilots who share your attitudes. As for me, I need to get to my daughter's school. Being present for Emma is part of being the kind of man and businessman I want to be." Robert watched through the window as David walked across the tarmac toward the parking area. Ground crew members waved respectfully as he passed, and he stopped to speak briefly with several of them. It was clear that David Chen was not just an owner but a respected leader who had earned the loyalty of his employees. As David drove away, probably hurrying to make his daughter's parent-teacher conference, Robert remained in the cockpit thinking about everything that had happened. His prejudices had cost him more than just a job opportunity. They had revealed something about himself that he didn't like, something that he would need to change if he wanted to be the kind of person he claimed to be. The successful businessman he had dismissed as an amateur was probably sitting in a school classroom by now, being the kind of dedicated father that Robert had mocked. And Robert was sitting alone in an aircraft, wondering how his assumptions about strength, success, and professionalism had been so completely wrong.